Good morning, everybody. We're going to start off in Luke 17, so go ahead and open up to that. As you can tell, we are in the middle of our geography class, specifically this morning, Nazareth and Bethlehem. I originally had Samaria involved in this discussion, and I thought that probably needs to be relegated to another class just because probably at least a couple slides worth of information. But these two are cities obviously super famous in the New Testament. As I mentioned last week, we're officially out of the Old Testament in terms of stories and background material. Obviously, a lot of this happens in the same area. And so we'll talk about Bethlehem and Nazareth this morning. Specifically, I think the topography of the area. We'll get really into specifically the geography as we approach this morning. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Paul, do you mind to lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. Thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to be in Bethlehem and Nazareth. Those names should obviously ring a bell with anybody that's opened up any part of the New Testament. What is Jesus' connection to both of these towns? I kind of want to get this, just to lay the groundwork for what we're dealing with. What is Jesus' connection to these two towns? Born in Bethlehem and lived in Nazareth. And I think that's important to get because, at least, I don't know if it's for me, sometimes I get these places kind of confused, and so it's good to know where this is going to be because this is part of the class that we're talking about this morning. Bethlehem is where Jesus was born. Nazareth is where Jesus was raised. That's where his family was from. That's obviously where Joseph was from. They live there, then they go down to Bethlehem, they come back up. So that's roughly the two main things. Then you've got Samaria, where Jesus worked once. We tend to think about Samaria as being this hotbed of all this activity. Jesus really was only there once. When was he in Samaria? I mean, he was in there several times, but in terms of biblical stories, what happened in Samaria? It is the woman at the well. Yeah, that's the story that talks, to me, in my opinion, that kind of talks about the differences between these two groups of people. Jesus would oftentimes pass around that. It certainly wasn't uncommon for people to go around that. One of the things that I think is interesting and worth bringing up, at least at this point, is that Samaria and Galilee and Judea, they weren't necessarily as divided as sometimes we think about. When you look in John chapter 4, it mentions specifically that the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. That is a very explicit type of phrase. That delineation isn't always as black and white as sometimes we think about it. Obviously, there's quite a few disagreements, but it's not as necessarily as ironclad as we sometimes think. What region is Jesus from? Where is Nazareth at? So remember, you got Judah or Judea, then you've got Samaria, and then what's north of that? Curtis? It is Galilee, and this is something that literally occurred to me on Thursday that I thought to myself, I don't know anything about Galilee, why it's called that, where it kind of got its origination from. Why is it called Galilee? Does anybody know? Glad to know that you're all in the same boat that I was. Go ahead. Well, yeah, the Sea of Galilee, yeah, but one of those came first. The Sea of Galilee, by the way, we're going to talk about bodies of water in Israel next week. Sea of Galilee goes by a lot of different names. So I think the Sea of Galilee came after the region known as Galilee. Why is it known as Galilee? Does anybody know? It is mentioned in the Old Testament. Originally, it was part of a series of towns, or specifically Galilee of the Gentiles was mentioned. That was north of Judea. That's kind of that area that he's talking about. Galilee eventually kind of became known as all of that region up there, so I think that's worth talking about. But Galilee is its own very distinct geographical region from all of those. If you look at any kind of map of the ancient world in biblical times, you've got Galilee, then you've got Samaria, you've got Judea. Those are all three very distinct places. Once again, not as ironclad. It's not like now we're crossing into Galilee and now we're in Samaria. There's some buffer zones in there. But Galilee, in a lot of ways, is very similar to what you would see elsewhere within these places. It develops the same type of way. Galilee originally belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. If you look at Joshua chapter 20 and verse 7, Galilee is mentioned as being a specific town inside of this area. Naphtali is one of the many areas in Israel that was eventually carried off into captivity. The lands were gifted to Hiram by Solomon. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 9. Who is Hiram? This is like ultra mega Bible trivia, but it is there, I promise you. It's not just me coming up with it. Somebody know? Hiram is an ally of David, and that's an important kind of point to bring up. David and Hiram worked in sync together. You see that a lot happening within 2 Samuel. But Hiram eventually would be the person that would also be an ally of Solomon. Solomon reaches out to him. But probably his most notable contribution to Solomon's empire was it was Hiram and his area that provided the trees that Solomon used to build the temple. And so they were certainly kind of these allies, at least in economical areas. They were certainly close towards each other. But Hiram eventually got burned a little bit by Solomon. There were some disagreements that happened later in Solomon's reign. I don't think it involves his 900 women. I don't think it does, at least. But Hiram, at least at this point, had a series of towns that were granted to him by Solomon because of his contributions to the temple. So you see that kind of taking place there. You see that little dissolution of at least the Israel empire at that point. Then it's captured by Assyria, as was Samaria. Both of those areas are taken together and moved off into captivity. That happens in 2 Kings chapter 15 and verse 29. But why does Samaria, if both of those places, of Samaria and Galilee, before it was known as Galilee, if that whole region is taken off into captivity, why do you have a distinctly Samaritan persona and then a distinctly Galilee persona? Because I think that's fascinating when you think about it. Why do you have two different cultures existing in the same geographical region? Anybody know? Okay, you're mostly right. When Samaria, when those people are taken off into captivity, Samaria is eventually returned. But the key point, this was something that maybe I never thought of before, never had really seen, is that Samaritans are released immediately pretty much right after that captivity. Within 5, 10, 20 years, you see the Samaritans that are repopulated. How did he repopulate the Assyrian area, or the Samaritan region? 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29 talks about the king deporting all those Jews and then filling it with who? There's still quite a few Jews there. There's a heavy Gentile influence. The Assyrian king would repopulate them with people from other parts. So you see this redistribution of the Assyrian empire. You have quite a healthy sum of Jews that are there, but then you also see them being brought in, a bunch of Gentiles that are being brought in. But that reassimilation in Samaria happens essentially right after the deportation. So they're allowed to kind of develop their own culture and develop their own kind of area for quite a bit of time. Galilee is not rehabitated until probably 300 or 400 years later. And so you've got this hotbed of activity with this Jewish Gentile population, people that are kind of mingling with each other. Then when the rest of it is brought in, you have the Galilean region that is kind of seen as being the other portion. And that's probably the interesting part about this dynamic between the two. How does Judea view Galilee? If you cross over Samaria and go up to Galilee, how does the people from Judea view the Galileans? Curtis, go ahead. Right.
Judeans would view the Galileans, that they weren't the metropolitan type, they were the rural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people from the town of Podunk, Alabama probably don't appreciate that comparison, but you're right, yeah. It is actually interesting because when you think about this relationship that Judah has with Galilee, it's almost exactly the same way as northerners would view the southerners. They would view them as kind of, maybe not technologically advanced, maybe they would view them as somewhat backwards. And certainly there are some things that kind of fit into that stereotype, but you have this in reverse. Judah looks at Galilee as being these backwards people that are from Podunk area. They're a bunch of hicks. They're not really that strong. But what's fascinating about these people is they're very progressive. And I don't know if that is something that we share here in the South, but it's much more of a progressive area. And so that's why when you see Jesus working primarily in Galilee, obviously that's where he's from, that's why you see much more kind of acceptance of the things that he's talking about rather than you see in Jerusalem. It's much more progressive. People are much more open to his types of ideas. Go ahead.
One thing that illustrates that perspective is when the day of Pentecost, when so many nations were gathered together in Jerusalem like they were supposed to be.
Right.
And when the Holy Spirit fell upon the apostles,
Mm-hmm.
that they began to speak not only languages, but dialects that they were familiar with from their home.
Right.
So that how are we hearing all these men speaking our own dialects, and yet these are mere Galileans. They aren't the educated. They didn't go to universities here.
Yeah. It is fascinating. I mean, if you look at a map of Galilee, you're not going to find any, as you mentioned earlier, you're not going to find any major metropolitan areas. It's not like there's places there that are just bustling with commerce and activity and hubs. There's none of that happening in the Galilean region, primarily because it's not as cemented and foundational as you found in Judea. Judea has been around for 1,000 years by that point. Jerusalem is there. You have you have Jericho. You have these other places that have been there for at least a few hundred years. Galilee is very much this backwards type of place. If you look at Luke the 17th chapter, did you have something? Yeah, I don't want to go too much into Samaria because we're going to talk about that primarily with its relationship to Jerusalem in that class. But you're right. I mean, when you think about Judah, how they look at Galilee, they're at least accepting that they're the same type of people. Samaritans are often left field doing their own thing. So there's not as much of an animosity as much as there is just a hostile indifference. Yeah, you're over there, we're over here. You just keep where you're at. We won't kind of get in the way. If you look at Luke chapter 17, verse 11, there's this mention of this kind of corridor between this. Look in verse 11. While he was on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing between Samaria and Galilee. That's what I talked about a second ago. There's a buffer zone between these regions where most of these people tried to cross, primarily because it was relatively safe for those people. It wasn't as hostile. Look in verse 12. As he entered a village, 10 leprous men stood at a distance, met him, and they raised their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on them. When he saw them, he said to them, Go and show yourselves to the priests. And as they were going, they were cleansed. Now one of them, when he turned back, or saw that he had been healed, turned back, glorifying God with a loud voice, fell and gave thanks, or he fell on his face at his feet, giving thanks to him, and he was a Samaritan. This buffer zone in between Galilee and Samaria is where this interaction takes place. That's why you have a mix of Samaritans and Galileans dwelling in that same area. Why is it notable that the Samaritan, to your point, the Samaritan was the only person that said anything? Samaritan and this group of 10 were the only people that didn't, or that came and gave thanks back to God. Why is that noteworthy? Yeah, Ken? They do despise the Samaritans, and you're right about that. I mean, there's that hateful indifference. Right. And that's probably the main point to draw out of that. When you look at John chapter 4, there's the issue of religion. You believe this way, we believe this way. So there's that religious difference that they think each of them are kind of wrong. That's what the woman at the well says to Jesus. The idea that this person could demonstrate faith, it's said in the same type of breath of Gentiles demonstrating faith. And that's what's noteworthy.
One of the things, remember when Jesus picked Nathaniel? Nathaniel's response, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So,
yeah. But keep in mind, this is talking about Samaria. This instance right here is talking about Samaritans. What you're talking about is the Galilean. Right. Yeah, he picked them from people that were already following them. But you're right. When Nathanael is told about Jesus by his brother Philip, he says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's the interesting thing about Nazareth, is it's so oftentimes used as kind of a slur word. It's just kind of this denigration comment that they make about those people. When you get back to Bethlehem, that was kind of a segue to talk about Galilee, because I really had never thought much about where the name Galilee came from. When you think back to this relationship between Bethlehem and Nazareth, Nazareth is in the north, Bethlehem is in the south, you see these working in conjunction really well with the story of Jesus' birth. Look back at Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was not a super common occurrence, but obviously it's going to happen every so often, primarily for taxation purposes. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. If you look in some skeptics' guides, they'll argue that this can't have happened because this type of situation with both of these people in power happened later. I think there's plenty of evidence to support that it does happen in that, but just for your information, if you might run into people that argue about that. Verse 3, everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was in the house of the family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in clothes, laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. It's a really kind of cute, adorable story. You see this mentioned, obviously, at one specific time of year. But we look at this story and we think, okay, this is a great story of these people traveling, and then you have the baby, and you have the manger, you have all these things taking place. I think there's strong evidence to indicate that this whole trip probably could have killed every last single one of them. If you look, for instance, at Nazareth up in the north down to Jerusalem, as the crow flies, this distance is 70 miles. That's not too bad. The people in a caravan in those days could obviously cover that probably in about a week, maybe a week and a half, so it's not really that harrowing. If you're talking about the route that they took, which if you can see that black line up there on the screen, that's probably where they went. They went down a little bit over towards the Jordan River Valley and then across towards Jerusalem. That's primarily because you have this massive mountain range that flanks this Jordan River on both the east and the west side of the river. The primary route was to go down to the Jordan River Valley and then scoot back over towards Jerusalem. That's the way that they went. But this elevation change alone from just those 70 miles is about 1,400 feet. If you're going as the crow flies from Nazareth down towards Jerusalem, it's about 1,400 feet. If you're taking this alternate route, that's where things get a little dicey. For instance, Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee, if you go straight or rather a little southeast, you're looking at an elevation drop of almost 2,000 feet. And obviously this changes depending on where you're starting and your ending points are. If you're going down from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, that's another 609 feet down. And then if you go all the way from the Dead Sea up to Bethlehem, which is cutting west, southwest, you're looking at almost 4,000 feet elevation rise. That's a massive amount of elevation change. You're dealing with all sorts of dangers. You're dealing with all sorts of issues, mountainous terrain. But what's the hardest part of this entire trip for Joseph and Mary? She's pregnant, and she's not just a little bit pregnant. How pregnant is she? I like the way you said that. She is great with child, which means she's probably in her third trimester. And so if you're thinking about this from a purely practical standpoint, you're Joseph, the last thing you want to do when you're at this stage of the pregnancy is make this kind of trip. There are all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't ever take this type of trip. This is a crosshatch of the elevation change. If you're looking at it directly from a horizontal standpoint, the sea or the Mediterranean is over there on the left, and then the eastern side of the Jordan River is on the right. You see that it rises towards the Jordan River, and then it drops essentially straight down into the Jordan River, and then it goes essentially straight back up. And so if you are 6, 7, 8 months pregnant, hopefully she's not all the way to 9 months pregnant, but if you're this close to the end term of your pregnancy, you're doing a little bit of mountain climbing on your way down to Bethlehem, and nobody anticipates that. Look at Psalm 42. And the topography of this area has a lot to do with like the biblical literature, really influences a lot of things. Look in Psalm 42, starting in verse 5. When the psalmists are talking about this region, they're not just saying, oh, this happened and they went here. It plays into especially a lot of the Psalms that they would say. Psalm 42, starting in verse 5. He says, why are you in despair, O my soul, and why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him for the help of my presence. O my God, my soul is in despair within me, therefore I remember you from the land of the Jordan and the peaks of Hermon from Mount Mizar. Where is Mount Hermon? Does anybody know? We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. Does anybody know where Mount Hermon is? Mount Hermon is the far north. If you look past the Sea of Galilee, it's some huge mountain range that's just north of the Sea of Galilee. It's so high up in the air that Jews go there to ski sometimes in the winter. So you have all that land up there, the peaks of Mount Hermon, which is one of the tallest points in Judea, and then it goes steadily down until you get towards the Dead Sea. That's that massive elevation drop. And so when he says here in verse 6, I remember you from the land of Jordan, the peaks of Hermon from Mount Mizar. And then he says in verse 7, deep calls to deep at the sound of your waterfalls. All your breakers, your waves have rolled over me. The Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and his song will be with me in the night, a prayer to the God of my life. Why does he say this in Psalm 42? Deep calls to deep from Mount Mizar. Why does he talk about this in relationship to his remembrance of God? And this is just one example. This specifically with Mount Hermon. That's why I wanted to isolate it. But this same type of motif is all throughout the Psalms. Why does he use mountain ranges and elevation to illustrate his love towards God? If I said to you that I love you from the top of the mountains to the deepest river or the deepest ocean, what would that indicate?
So it's a vision. I mean, it gives you a vision of the ups and downs, how deep that is.
Yeah, you can look at it as a metaphor, and you can say I love you no matter if I'm at the top of the mountain or I love you at the bottom of the ocean. You can certainly look at it in terms of depth. How else would you use that phrase? the vastness, all the way from the east to the west, and that's what Paul uses, I think, in Galatians. I pray that you would think about the love that God has for you as the depth and the width and the height, all those different types of things. Why else would you use mountain ranges to illustrate your loving kindness, or illustrate your remembrance and love? Yeah, Paul?
I guess because it shows you have that love of all of them.
Right. That's the way that it's commonly used. When you look at, for instance, in the later Psalms, and he says, if I go down to the depths of the ocean, you're there. If I go to this place, you're there. It's very much used in a situational aspect. It doesn't matter from the top of Mount Hermon, from the bottom of this ocean. It doesn't matter. I still remember you no matter what the situation calls for. And when he mentions this in Psalm 42, I remember you from the peaks of Hermon all the way, or from Mount Mizar all the way down to this area. This is how I remember. You remember all the time. It doesn't just matter if I'm here, there, anywhere. I remember you all the time. And so I think when you come across these, they're very interesting and they're very noteworthy when you look at these in the Psalmic literature. When you eventually come down, if Joseph and Mary are coming down from Nazareth and they're heading towards the Jordan River Valley, there's also a high likelihood that they would get lost, primarily because when you look at the way the Jordan River snakes, it is extremely windy. It looks like spaghetti, but it also has a tendency to flood east and west. And so if you're looking at a map of this anytime from the last 100 years, chances are that no two maps will look the same, primarily because the Jordan River has a tendency to flood and expand, has a tendency to contract. And so whereas you may look at it and say, okay, the river goes like this, at a different point in the year, the river could go like that. And of course, Mark Twain, with always the best quotes for anything involving anything in world history, he says the Jordan River is so crooked that a man doesn't know which side of it he is on half the time. I mean, it's so easy to get lost inside this Jordan River, primarily because you can't really tell where you're at half the time. Obviously, they're traveling down a very familiar trade route, but there's lots of dangers. And in case you think the danger changes when you get out of the mountains, if you get down into the Jordan River Valley and go anywhere outside of where that river is, there's a high likelihood that you will be in a jungle. When you look at this Jordan River, especially the area outside of this is what's called the pride of the Jordan River Valley. And not only do you have regular animals there, however you splice regular animals, but you also have lions, and you also have bears. When David confronts Saul and tells Saul that he had killed a lion and a bear, he has escaped from the paw of those things, he's probably talking about places like this. Bethlehem is not too far from the Jordan River Valley, and so there's a great chance that while he's out there handling his flocks, in comes a lion, in comes a bear, he kills them both because this is where they live. And so think about that if you're Joseph and you're leading Mary down this area. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on any of this? Just to wrap up, for those that are keeping score at home, these are all the possible dangers that Mary and Joseph could come from when you're talking about this census trip in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. First and foremost, you're talking about massive elevation changes. That's a given. You're going all over the place kind of regards to this. Number two, you're dealing with rocky terrain. Mary slips and snaps her ankle. That's going to be a bad day for everybody. You also have heat. Heat fluctuation changes from the north to the south, especially when you go elevation as well. Sometimes close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and go all the way down to 40 sometimes, depending on where you're at. So massive temperature changes. Water scarcity, because as you get closer to the Dead Sea, what happens to the water? It gets salty, but it also collects what else? If it's traveling from Hermon all the way through all these different things to this jungle, what else is in there? Yeah, asphalt, you've got other things that are taking place, you've got bacteria, you've got all sorts of things. And so just because you're at the Jordan River doesn't mean that you have a water source. If you've looked at the Jordan River, it's disgusting, so much so that when Naaman is told to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times, what does he say? Yeah, there's cleaner rivers in Damascus. And he's not wrong. The rivers in Damascus are great because they come straight off of Mount Hermon. Down by the time you get to the Jordan River, it's just disgusting. And so obviously he doesn't want to go bathe in that. He's way above that type of thing. You also have thieves and bandits. How do you know about thieves and bandits being in this area? What story illustrates that? Parable of the Good Samaritan, exactly. So you're dealing with that. That's why people travel in a caravan. If Joseph and Mary are fortunate enough to travel in a caravan, that's great. Being from a city like Nazareth, where there's not that many people, basically everybody has the same last name, it might not be that you're traveling with that big of a company. The fact that they were probably dirt poor helped their matters, helped their situation quite a bit, but you're still dealing with that. Dealing with dangerous wildlife, you're doing all of this in terms of a late-stage pregnancy, which is difficult by itself. And then what do you still have to do once the journey's over? What's that? You have to pay taxes. That wasn't a danger, but yes. I love that that's where your mind went. What's that? You have to find a place to stay. That's difficult too. That's where Joseph and Mary end up in an inn. In a manger, stable. What do you have to do after all this is over and you've paid taxes after you found a place to stay? You got to go home. So not only are you making this trip once, but you're making this trip twice. And so when we read this story in Luke chapter 2, it's very easy to say, oh, they traveled from Bethlehem, they got in their car, they had a little road trip, they packed all their bags, they're packing. It's not nearly that easy because you're dealing with basically the worst road trip that you can possibly make. Terrain, thieves, water. There's nothing there that signals that you should survive. And I think the difference in this climate, specifically in Judea, is what makes this place so fascinating. You're dealing with every different type of season, you're dealing with every different type of topography, and you're doing it all when you're trying to stay faithful towards God. So it makes for a very rich kind of narrative environment for all these things. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that? Yep.
It shows we really don't have any excuses then. I mean, find every excuse under the sun not to live a godly life, not to attend the services, but come on, look what they did.
You say that, but Texas without AC should probably be on that list. So if the AC goes out, I'm going to complain at least a little bit, but I'll just be here with a fan. So, yeah, go ahead, Jeff. But you're right about that, the general point. They had a lot worse than we did.
And I can imagine the upheaval because I'm assuming Mary and Joseph weren't the only ones moving around back to their original city.
Back going, yeah.
There's got to be just a massive upheaval.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about this from a thief's perspective, okay, we've got this great migration that's taking place. Everybody get your stuff. We're going to go park ourselves on these roads. There's going to be people traveling. And it shows, by the way, that Joseph, even though he was from Nazareth, that at least his point of origination for his family line came from Bethlehem. And Bethlehem has a rich and storied history in biblical literature. For instance, you have that being called the city of David. Not Jerusalem, or Jerusalem is oftentimes seen as being the city of David. Bethlehem is actually where David is from. And there's a great story, I think in 2 Samuel, I can't remember, I think it's in 22, 23, where David is so thirsty that he begs for water from inside of Bethlehem, and then his mighty men break rank, go in there, take the water, and they give it to him. That all happens outside of Bethlehem. So it has a very rich and storied history. Nazareth, on the other hand, isn't mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. So it's really a place that pops up and has some life, but you don't really have a lot of history like you do with Bethlehem. And so, yeah, you're right. You have all these things that are taking place. Look in Luke chapter 2, starting verse 8. Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 8. Luke chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, in the same region there were some shepherds. This is back to Jesus' birth. There were some shepherds staying out in the fields and keeping watch over their flock by night. An angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which will be for all the people. For today in the city of David there has been born to you a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in clothes and lying in a manger. And suddenly there appeared with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among men with whom he is pleased. And then in my opinion, the part that gets overlooked, when the angels had gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to another, let us go straight into Bethlehem then, and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. So they came in a hurry, found their way to Mary and Joseph and the baby as he lay in the manger. What's the situation here in Luke chapter 2, 8 through 16? What happens? Jesus and Mary are already in Bethlehem. He's born. That happens in 6 and 7. What happens in verses 8 through 14? Yeah. For some reason I got all these images of gender reveal parties in my head. It's not the same thing. Yeah. It's announcing Christ's birth, and it's a super dramatic scene. And you have the angels that are talking, and then the angels give their message, and then they depart, and you have all the angels that are taking place. It's very reminiscent of Jesus' death whenever the two angels appear at the tomb, so it's kind of bookending from that perspective.
It's also interesting to me that it's announced to the shepherds. It's not announced to the priests or the leaders or anything. It's announced
Right.
to the shepherds.
I want to ask why that's, because I agree with you that I think that is fascinating. Why is it fascinating that it was given to the shepherds? Actually, I hadn't thought about that. It wasn't given to royalty. Okay, so Jeff makes the comment and then he backs out of the conversation. That's very strategic on his perspective.
You know, I mean, Christ is going to be our shepherd.
He is.
It's that representation.
Yeah, I come back to the idea. I do agree with you that the shepherd illustration kind of carries over. I think probably the response of the shepherds is why they were chosen to go do that, because they go and see. Everybody else is thinking to themselves, what's happening here? If you go down later in this chapter, Herod has a different response, which is, let's go kill him. So the response, I think, of the shepherd is probably the reason that they were chosen. What is the shepherd's response in Luke chapter 2? They see this grand scene. They hear the message of the birth of Jesus. What do? They say, let's go to Bethlehem, and that you say that they went, and that's true, but they had to leave the sheep to go do that. And I don't really think we think about that, because this is essentially their job. If they are in Bethlehem looking at this baby, and half the sheep are slaughtered, it's on them. So it shows a little bit of their devotion, their faith, that, hey, we got to go check this thing out, see the scene that takes place. When we think of this scene in Bethlehem, we oftentimes think of rolling prairies and these shepherds. They're sitting on top of these little tiny hills with all this grassland, holding their staff. That's not shepherding in Bethlehem. If you're a shepherd in Bethlehem, this is most likely your office. This is a very mountainous terrain. You have lots of hills. You have holes in the area. This is where David hid from Saul because of the terrain type situation. And then if you can see it, there are little stone walls that you have there built around. This is built right into the hills of Bethlehem. Why do you think they have these stone walls? And they're really more like turrets, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. Why would you have stone walls and stone turrets built into the hillside in Bethlehem if you're a shepherd? What's that? The walls are certainly going to help keep the sheep intact. They're going to be there. Helps with herding them. But notice they're sporadic. They're not right next to each other. And so you've got these rises, these turrets. What are you going to use those for if you're a shepherd? Go ahead. They're defensive positions. If you look at that terrain and you think to yourself, oh, I'll just go get an easy job as a shepherd, and this is your office, and you're standing out there, the last thing you're going to see at night is a lion or a bear creeping around the corner going after your sheep. So they built these kind of rises out of stone into the hillside so they could stand on top of them and have a better vantage point of the area around them. It's not the easiest job in the world. And so for them to say, hey, we're going to go look at this thing, we're just going to leave these sheep out here by themselves, that I think is a little bit fascinating. Micah chapter 5, verse 2, the prophecy that was given to them all the way back in the day about where the Messiah would be born. This is what the priests tell Herod later. This is what we know about the birth of Jesus. What does it tell us about Bethlehem? What does Micah 5 and 2 say about Bethlehem? It's a nondescript city, and you're right about that, despite the fact that so many notable people came out of Bethlehem. You saw David that's mentioned there. I think Ruth and Boaz came out of Bethlehem. There's that whole journey, which if you parse Ruth chapter 1, you see the distance they've traveled. It's quite a hike by itself. But it's a very noteworthy city because of the people that came out of this. But there's nothing really of significance there. And what was always fascinating me about this verse is if I knew the Messiah was going to come from here, which is an established fact if you look at Luke chapter 2, why am I not setting up shop? I'm staying there for a long time just to be there in case this Messiah comes. The fact that it was still a very insignificant city, I think, speaks to maybe the faith of these people in this area. And maybe I'm way off base on that, but that's just my own personal perspective. After Jesus is born, where is he placed? I thought you were going to say manger. He isn't a trough. He's an animal trough. And the depictions of this in art, depending on which one you look at, they're gorgeous. I mean, you have the moonlight creeping in through the window and illuminating the manger, and there's just these blankets upon blankets. This is most likely the house that they were probably in. And if you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, this doesn't look like a Motel 6, you're probably right. I mean, this might actually look like a Motel 6, but this isn't a Hampton or anything like that. This is not a place that you would comfortably be. But you're probably jamming at least 15 or 20 people in this because if you're traveling by convoy, this is where you're going to stay, this is where you're going to be at. The horse troughs, or where Jesus was placed, is probably either one of two locations. It's either this boulder on the bottom left, which is a bowl of sorts that you would place them in, or it's in the right, because those are the slots by which the animals would stick their head in to look at you while you're sleeping. So Jesus was probably placed in one of those two areas. Most places, most art depicts it as being a wooden manger. Wood is too sacred and too rare in this part of the world to be used for something like a horse feeding trough, so it's most likely a stone basin that Jesus was placed in. If you look down at Luke chapter 2 and verse 39, this is the return trip we were talking about earlier. When they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. And the child continued to grow and became strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was within him. They now return back to Nazareth, and this is the second city that we can spend at least a few minutes talking about before we end this morning. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 23 says he came, talking about Jesus, he came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken of by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Where does this prophecy come from? Everybody's looking at their cross references. Where does this prophecy come from? He shall be called a Nazarene. I don't think it was mentioned by any angel, at least that I can think of. The answer, if you're looking really, really hard, the answer is it's not anywhere in the Old Testament. And this has caused lots of people issues because if you do a search for the city of Nazareth, it literally doesn't appear until you get to Matthew, until you get to the New Testament. And a lot of people have issues with this because they look at this and they say, well, how can he be called a Nazarene or how can there be a prophecy about him being called a Nazarene if there's no prophecy in the Old Testament about him being called a Nazarene? How do you justify that in your mind? If you're talking with the skeptic about this prophecy specifically, and the Old Testament, this says he will fulfill by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. There's no Old Testament prophecy about him being called a Nazarene. How do you rectify that in your mind?
For one, we don't have every recording of every prophet. Prophecy that was made.
No, but to be fair, I think most every other time there's a prophecy mentioned, there is a direct reference in the Old Testament, whether it's semi around it, whether it's direct, or whether it's a smashing of multiple prophecies. There's always some way that you can piece it together from the Old Testament. But you're all right, that's a fair point. The general understanding of this, at least from an apologetic standpoint, is that when he says he shall be called a Nazarene, this is one of two things. Either this is a regional thing by which they're saying he shall be called a Nazarene from the area, and this was kind of an amalgamation of different things that was said after the fact. The prophets are not Old Testament prophets, but rather New Testament prophets. Or the idea is that a translator came in and said maybe the original word said something different, but we know it as Nazareth, and so that's what we're going to use. I think both of those can apply in different ways, and you can certainly come up with probably a dozen other ones. This one I grappled with for quite a while, primarily because I do think this is something that's an easy target for skeptics. But the biggest issue in my mind is when it says he shall be called a Nazarene, we look at that as a statement of fact. How would they have looked at a Nazarene in the first century? It was derision. 1,000%. And to your point that you mentioned earlier, when you look at John, the first chapter, verse 46, when Nathanael says that, he says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Why does he say that? Go ahead.
Because they were thought of as uneducated, sort of ignorant.
You're right, but keep in mind this.
One of the things that he thought they couldn't be.
I would agree with you, except that the person that's saying this is Nathanael, who's also a Galilean. So a Galilean's not going to say that about another Galilean unless there's a difference from where he's at and this guy's at. Which one are you talking about? Feel free to speak into the microphone. I mean, you bring up a good point, and this is the part where it gets a little dicey for us, because when we say, can anything good come out of Nazareth, it is used as a term of derision, but I don't think it's because they're backwards or they're podunk or anything like that. I don't really think that's the point here. Curtis?
Perhaps because there is no prophecy, specific prophecy.
I think that can be part of it too. I mean, if you're talking about we have found the Messiah and oh yeah, he's from Nazareth, they're like, well, that came out of left field. I didn't see that one because Micah chapter 5 verse 2 says Bethlehem. So how could he come out of Nazareth? Well, there is a fulfillment. It's just they didn't see it obviously in the moment. When they're talking about can anything good come out of Nazareth, what do they mean by that? Let me ask you this. This is where my part will be dicey. That's what I mentioned a second ago. If I say, can anything good come out of Miller Grove? How would you interpret that? There's nobody from Miller Grove here, is there? Okay. I didn't choose Wolf City because differences I'll talk about here in a second. If I say, can anything good come out of Miller's Grove, what would be your immediate response to that? We played them in football and they were terrible and nothing's good. That's not what you're thinking. Oh, they do have a good catfish place. You're right. We're not talking about catfish, though. We're talking about the Messiah. So you're close. But why would I say that? Can anything good come out of Miller's Grove?
Probably because you think nothing would.
I mean, it might be that I think that, but if you look, for instance, in Acts chapter 24 and verse 5, it mentions Nazarene as being a slanderous term. It is a denigration, it is a derision, but it's not because they're evil, and not because they're poor necessarily. It might be just my personal opinion. There's reputation. I think the main thing that he's getting at, and at this point is we think, well, just Nathanael hated Nazareth. That's not really the point. Point is there's nothing in Nazareth. If you say it's, the Messiah is coming out of Miller's Grove, your response would be what? What part of Miller's Grove? Is there where is that? Is there a hospital? Is there a Dollar General? I mean, where is it that he's coming from? Because my understanding of this town is that there's not really a ton there. And that's why I didn't choose something like Wolf City. Wolf City has landmarks. It has a city council, has these different things. Miller's Grove, to my knowledge, and if there are people from there here, you can correct me, has nothing of that sort. And so when you're talking about Nazareth, you're talking about it being basically not even a town as much as it is a buy stop on the way to somewhere else. That's the way that Nathanael meant Nazareth. And so that's the way that they would look at this. For instance, when you look at houses, this is a house that was found in Nazareth in 2009. I mean, they really didn't discover anything from this place until 2009. 900 square feet. You got enough space for a couple families. You got some space for some animals. And that's really it. Everything else is gone because Nazareth was not really a place that you built on top of and said, hey, let's keep this situation going. It was there, kind of filtered. It just didn't have an existence, really. I hate to be slanderous. I'm certainly not trying to diminish anybody from Miller's Grove, if anybody's watching from there on here. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments about that? Go ahead.
Maybe it's just the human mind. How can anything come out of Miller Grove? Why not, Dallas or some more important city that has, universities and things like that?
Yeah.
It's almost like, how can the mind maybe could fathom how can somebody so important come out of?
Right. Well, yeah, and you're right. I mean, if you think about, and I'm trying to think of a good corollary within history regards to this, but if you think of the great thinkers of humanity, the great movers and shakers, all of them had, the overwhelming majority had some version of a pedigree behind them. Nazareth doesn't have a history. And so what is in there to produce the greatest person that's ever lived, the greatest human being, which is God in the flesh? What's there to produce that? And so I think when you look at Nathanael's statement, it's not like, oh, well, they're terrible. Why would anything good ever come out of that? The point is that there's nothing there to produce that. And I think that's the argument. Go ahead.
I think that could be by design to show that this was from God.
Exactly. And that's really the point, because if you come from a big city with a big university, you can say, well, obviously he was schooled in that one. And if you look, for instance, in Acts the 5th chapter, when Gamaliel references 3 different insurrections, all of those come from people of, and maybe my memory is mistaking me here, but people from noteworthy rank. This is from a town. This is a guy that has this pedigree. So the fact that Jesus could arise from something like this, it doesn't make sense. It's like talking about the greatest baseball player that's ever lived being from Miller's Grove. What's there to produce that? So anyways, that's where I'm at on that one. Look in Luke the 4th chapter. There's one more story in regards to Nazareth that I like, and I think shows this idea specifically about Nazareth. Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout all the surrounding district. And he began teaching in the synagogues, and he was praised by all. This is Jesus' tour, part 1. This is right at the beginning of all of this type of stuff. Verse 16, he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, as he had done in other places, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up to read. The book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. He opened the book, found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And then probably the greatest mic drop moment in the entire history of the Bible, verse 20. He closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began to say to them, "Today his scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." What does the prophet Isaiah talk about in that prophecy? What is that prophecy detailing?
Detailing things that common man could not accomplish.
Right.
And so therefore, it can
exactly. There are 4 different servant prophecies in Isaiah. I think they start in 42, and then they go through 52 and 53. There's 4 different servant prophecies. 53 is the most notable one. But this, I think, falls into that section, or at least alludes back to that section, about the servant being somebody who restores the sight to the blind. He's preaching to the poor. He's proclaiming release to the captives. So he's talking about this, and as was the custom in synagogues of those days, you didn't just read something. You oftentimes provided commentary. He then says in verse 21, very simply, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, which essentially means, I'm this person. What's the reaction from the synagogue in Nazareth? The 12 people that were probably there. Go ahead, Curtis.
Can't this possibly be? We don't know who he is. He comes from his dad.
Okay, so you say that. That's the second reaction. What's the first reaction? They love this. They think this is the best thing they've ever heard. Verse 22, they're speaking well of him, wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. And they were saying, what you talked about, is this not Joseph's son? In other words, how can this be? This is so beautiful. We know Joseph's son, or we know Joseph, this is his son. This is so amazing. But then Jesus flips the script, verse 23. He says to them, no doubt you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have done, we have heard was done at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well. But I say to you, verse 21, no prophet is welcome in your hometown. Now they say essentially the same thing. Is this not Joseph's son? Exact same phrase used in adoration, verse 22. Now it's used in the term of slander. This can't be because this is Joseph's son. What's their reaction immediately after that? Goes all the way down through verse 30. They're filled with wrath. It's an angry quasi-mob. Yeah.
They were wanting to throw him over the cliff.
They didn't just want to. They drove him to the cliff. And in a passage I will never understand for as long as I live, it says he passed through their midst, which I would love. That's going to be the number one question when I get to heaven, is ask Jesus what he meant by that. The cliff that they're probably talking about is right here outside of Nazareth. This is not a tiny little cliff. And so this is one of, I think, a few. This is the traditional side of where this probably happened in Nazareth. But they drove him to the edge of this cliff with the intent to throw him over and kill him at this exact moment Jesus passes through their midst. This is all possible because of the terrain of Judea. And so when you think about this story, I think about this type of thing. Today, Nazareth is a celebrated town. It has a history that obviously dates back to the time of Jesus. There's a massive church. This is one of my favorite types of pieces of art. I'm not an art person by any stretch of the imagination. But when you look at this church specifically, it's called the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth. What they did outside of their walls, they have a whole bunch of stuff inside. What they did on the outside in their courtyard was they asked every culture throughout the entire world, give us your rendition of what this moment of Jesus being born and being announced to Joseph and Mary, what would that look like in your culture? And I would encourage you to look at all these because every culture you have up there, if you can read it, Ethiopia, France, Italy, you can see what every culture's depiction is of this moment. Sometimes Jesus is black. Sometimes Jesus is white. Sometimes Jesus has long hair. Sometimes short hair. But it's a really good image of the way every culture looks at this idea of Jesus, or at least of this moment. And so I think if you have some time, this would be worth a good 5-minute Google search, just to kind of look through the way these cultures look at it. Anybody have any thoughts or comments? Okay, next week we get into the bodies of water, Dead Sea, Jordan River, and Sea of Galilee. Thank you, everybody.